I want you to take a close look at this man. The bandages covering up his burned skin, the lack of limbs, those eyes that aren't quite dead. Not yet. It should rightfully disgust you. But my question then is why? Sure, he looks pretty gross, but why do you think that? What innate feeling is there underneath to make you react with such disgust? My guess comes back to the concept of abjection. And since you might not know what that is, let me briefly explain it to you and unravel the rest over the course of this video. For most of us, we have a relatively solidified sense of self. To put it simply, we know who we are. So that's why when we see something that is innately different from how we subjectively perceive ourselves, it is followed with disgust. A simple paper cut followed by minimal blood won't make most too squeamish. But seeing this man should certainly elicit a disturbed response, because we can reasonably assume he is a human with the same blood and arteries running through him that we all have. And yet, he just looks so different. And this serves as a drastic juxtaposition, a stark reminder that, on the inside, we all look like that. And what this then creates is a great dissonance. We can't handle what is inside because it directly clashes with our subjective image of ourselves. It clashes with our identity. If you don't know the brilliant video game Mouthwashing, you may not recognize the man we've been analyzing, Curly. After the mysterious crash of the Tulpar, Curly is left horribly disfigured, hanging on to life. If you haven't played or seen the game, please go do so before engaging with this video essay, because I will freely be spoiling the game as I please. Abjection is, at least foundationally, primarily in regards to feminist horror. Coined by Julia Kristeva, the concepts of identity and disgust go far beyond just the body that I previously discussed. This is something we will gradually be unraveling over the course of this very video. I've discussed Curly and mouthwashing in another video on the channel, one that I'm very proud of and one you should definitely watch. And in that video, I made the claim that almost all men are bad because most men, while not abusers themselves, are complacent in said abuse. Curly, the captain of the Tulpar, does nothing when Anya tells him that she was sexually assaulted and impregnated by the co-captain and Curly's good friend, Jimmy. And while we can argue all day if that statement is true, that most men are bad, or even what the definition of bad even is, I instead want to offer this. While abjection is, again, primarily feminist in nature, it's not exclusively so. And that men themselves are often victims of a patriarchal system that objectifies even them, although not quite in the same way. When in development, the self is incredibly delicate. Even later on in life, it can be influenced greatly. And when growing up in a capitalistic society, one created and absolutely dominated by men, one thing rings true above all. That worth is oftentimes determined by power, and that power comes in many forms. As Ryuan from Classroom of the Elite would say, violence is power and violence is absolute. But not all power is violence, and the dangerous pitfall of our society is believing they are one and the same, because that leaves you vulnerable to be taken advantage of by a system that wants you without power, yet still yearning for it. Curly, on the outside, has power. He has pulled himself up the corporate ladder all the way to captain, yet he is unsatisfied. And I believe this is because he doesn't necessarily want more, but rather he had desires as a kid that probably clashed with the idea that was reinforced into him time and time again that he must become powerful, whatever that even means. It's almost as if there are two of them in, well, him. He has his true identity, the one who desires something else out of life, but he also has an enforced identity, one that tells him to suck it up and keep pushing up a ladder without any rungs left. There is nowhere else to go, and yet that other self tells him he must simply fly instead. There is a divide in his very self, and he is unsure where his identity lies. This, friends, is classic abjection. It is the need for a solidified sense of self in a world where such a thing may not be possible. It is the disgust one feels when they are not who they believe themselves to be or want themselves to be. And for Curly, this second self wins in the end, becoming so afraid of failure of power that he lets Anya live on the ship with her abuser. He even lets Jimmy eventually crash that ship. Here is a brief excerpt from my original mouthwashing analysis explaining this concept of failure. In a moment of hesitation, Curly lets Jimmy crash the ship. And while I think this conversation more or less speaks for itself, I do want to point out a running theme throughout the game. These people would rather die than fail according to the dystopian capitalistic society they live in. Swansea even says it at the start of the game, that the only thing worse than starving to death is to not get paid. I don't think Swansea is a man that pressed for cash, and that this instead points us to, again, this concept of failure. And what's interesting about this is that while failure is so evident within this system, with endless possibilities, it's unclear what success is. While failure is starving to death at home, Swansea would rather starve to death on the ship than not get the money he's owed, the money he needs to survive, which means it's probably not about the money necessarily. So while it's based in death, it's not necessarily defined by it. Success is even more abstract. While failure is both the death of the body and, more importantly I think, to at least Swansea, the death of the ego, success offers little substantial, substance. Even the richest people, the most successful according to the system, feel empty inside, or are just complete sociopaths anyway. Honestly though, it's hard to actually discern whether or not the portrayal of the sad rich person is actually accurate to real life, or if it's just completely fabricated by rich people. The music of Post Malone, a personal favorite of mine, shines a light on this dilemma with the obvious song Rich and Sad, but more subtly with Something Real. Austin would give it all love for something of actual substance, and illustrates how the life of a rich person is still filled with the same inevitable existential questions of that of someone of lower financial stature. But of course, I'm not Post Malone, so I couldn't say for certain whether this depiction is just a fictional facade to, maybe get you to stream his albums more based entirely on relatability. I'm not really sure. What I am sure about, though, is that Curly, even for just a second, would rather die than have his reputation tarnished, even if he's well off enough to get by financially. He is afraid, petrified even, to fail, to which there are so many ways to do so that it's even unclear which one pertains most to Curly, and it's just so abstract. Alright, I'm ending this on last minute voiceover note here, but it seems like it's not about death, right? And it's not even necessarily about success in a substance way. It's more of an abstract way. And I think this happens because we are born in this system and we are taught certain principles, right? We are shown what failure is, and failure is not succeeding. So it's like they go hand in hand, right? And that's where the death of the ego plays a part, where it's like, I guess I should say it this way. In my film America Dreamin', two of the characters discuss why people chase like success, or why people chase like they made it, you know? And I think a lot of that boils down to, obviously, like, people want to make it so they can give themselves a better life. But even more abstractly, I think it comes down to, like, we have this primal instinct to dominate the competition almost. And I think that mixes with this feeling of impacting the collective that has formed us, that has impacted us. And I think maybe that's what we see success as. And it's not really about living a better life. It's more so, like I said, a mixture of those two. And then obviously I'm not that delusional. Like, it is about living a more financially stable life. But it's like a combination of those three things, I think, makes up success. Like, why we pursue that. And failure then is like the exact opposite of that. It's not impacting the collective consciousness that has impacted us. It's this very abstract thing where it's not about the money necessarily. Like, I mean, even the money in the system is so abstract. It's so dependent on itself, like we've been talking about. Yeah, I don't know. These are just my thoughts. I literally am just adding this on last minute as I'm editing the voiceover for the previous part you just watched. Or actually, I'm editing this. Whatever. Those are just my thoughts. After he comes to his senses and goes to stop the crash, well, you know how he ends up. He has undoubtedly failed not society, but himself, his crew. Quote over. Importantly, this is not meant to absolve Curly of his own personal responsibility. I mean, the whole game is based around that concept of accountability, but it does help to explain and hopefully help with the problem. When success is so forcefully ingrained into you, especially if you're a man, that failing to do so, whatever that actually means, results in you losing your sense of self in the world. You lose your very identity even. And this failure can even still come in many forms. Above all, I believe it comes down to failure of being what society deems as a man. Men should be successful. Men should be powerful and strong. They have to stick together no matter what, even if it means ignoring the pleas of the women around them. Even if it means letting your best friend sexually abuse one of his and yours crewmates under your responsibility. Because if you don't do that, you're just a pussy. And when you have to understand is that this pressure on men, especially, is from a patriarchal source. The systems we have in place, from a grander scale of wider capitalism to even just a personal one, have all been established by men. That's what you have to understand, but what you have to take away from it is that your identity, yourself, should be what you want it to be. I know it's hard, since your very desires are shaped by what you were taught, but I plead with you to look deeper into yourself and take another look at your soul. I think it is the duty as a man to protect the women in your life, and not in the white knight or controlling or toxic way. No, instead, in the way that sees women and other men as human and deserving of kindness. The way we have to all protect each other. We all, including myself, have to deprogram and unlearn what this sick society has taught us. We just do. To help out the next Anya in the world. What I don't want this video to be is men bad. Because, to be frank, I feel like it's a rather shallow interpretation of a patriarchal system that I hope I explained well enough in the previous section. I also feel that only serves to further radicalize men that feel like they're on the outskirts of society. The truth is that people can just be bad, or at least do bad things, regardless of gender. But what's important to remember is that not only does the system we live in allow for abuse of all kinds, but sometimes is the catalyst for it. Jimmy from Mouthwashing is a great example. He sees himself as someone who lacks control of his life under the late-stage capitalism he finds himself in, and so he desires to take control from someone else, a woman in Anya who is deemed even lesser by that very same system. But again, what's vital to understand here is that this system was designed by men. This obviously doesn't absolve Jimmy of his sins, but perhaps it can help to explain his motives. I alluded to it earlier, but perhaps Jimmy and Curly feel a semblance of the male gaze, that second self that critiques the main self and tries to guide it down towards a male-centric future. When I say men as horror, I don't exclusively mean it from the purely feministic lens. Instead, I, 1, want to analyze how men can become horror to others, and 2, to examine the horror within themselves. After all, people are rarely born as monsters. I'm instead interested in how they get there, and how other men can enable them to even get that far. But, of course, I can't neglect the very real stories of women. So I want to take some time to analyze the first episode of Lacey Games, a YouTube horror series turned actual game that I implore you to watch or play in its entirety. It's surely worth your time. The first episode of the series, Lacey's Wardrobe, has you dressing a girl named Lacey, presumably to go on a date. The twist is, a man stalks you the entire time, and upon completion of the game, kills and eats Lacey. Now, this is not going to be a full analysis of the entire series, that's for perhaps future Alex to do. Instead, I want to take a different approach. I want to analyze this first episode through the context of the male gaze. Now, while this isn't a full series analysis, like I said, I will say that Rocio, the in-series creator of Lacey Games, was probably abused by her uncle. This is mostly revealed in other episodes, but I feel it important to make clear because the horror that Lacey feels and experiences in Lacey's Wardrobe, I don't think is to be taken metaphorically. I originally played around with the idea that the stalker was a stand-in for the male gaze, but quickly changed my mind on that. Within the game's world, he is an organic, immediate threat. But I don't think the concept of the male gaze has nothing to do with this episode. Instead, I want you to point the finger at, well, you. After all, one of the mainstays of the male gaze is how it influences women to dress, criticizing them rather equally for being too boring or too revealing. And it is you as the player within the game's metastructure that chooses what Lacey will wear. And it is you she questions when you make her leave the house, asking, "What have you done?" I think Lacey Games does a great job in showing the opposite side of Curly. Because while we can reasonably understand Curly's inaction, the stalker in Lacey's Wardrobe is a complete unknown. It could be anyone on the street, and it is the embodiment of men as horror in its purest form. But even beyond that, what strikes me about this episode is what it says about abject horror at large. Abject horror is typically discussed not in regards to bodily disgust, but rather for instances where one loses their identity. It is the ultimate displacement, where one fully realizes they are a living human, yet doesn't see themselves as belonging within the set society that other living humans inhabit, mostly because they've been cast out. Yes, traditionally, abjection is defined by the line between self and non-self, like the bodily horror we already discussed, but when actually expanded into realistic models, it becomes such that to feel abject horror is the feeling of feeling like one thing, but realizing society has cast you out as something else. Something other. For Curly, his abject horror came from that concept of failure. For Lacey in this episode, this comes from not dressing appropriately based on the patriarchal society's view of what appropriate is. Both are influenced by the male gaze, just in drastically different ways. For Lacey and women at large, clothing can be everything, because they are unfairly and disproportionately judged by how they look. But of course, the abject horror becomes shattered because no matter what they wear, men remain horror. And some men will prey on them no matter what they're wearing. As Infinite Snow Productions puts it, it's not that all men will, but it's that any man could. Now, it is true that Shinji, during the time of the story, is a 14-year-old kid. While I don't believe we should hold literal children with the same accountability we hold adults to, there does need to be a sense of accountability there. And in this way, Shinji definitely exemplifies men as horror. Shinji does not know who he wants to be, but like Curly, there is a forced ideal placed onto him for success. Of course, what is deemed successful is placed entirely on a higher patriarchal system. And for Shinji, that is Gendo Ikari, his father. He mustn't run away, not because he actually wants to stay, but because others want him to. He must get in the robot, because others expect him to. Of course, this is just one viewpoint on a very complex character. I'm not saying you have to subscribe to the idea that this is what Anno meant when writing Shinji. Honestly, I'm not even sure I believe that, but it is surely an interpretation. This section also is not a full analysis of Evangelion that will come at a later date. Rather, it's a focus on some of Shinji's story within the framework of men as horror. So, Shinji Ikari is given his identity from others. But while an adult like Curly has other things he wants, another identity to subscribe to, a child like Shinji doesn't always have that. This, friends, is a step beyond abject horror. It is the male gaze supplementing itself as the main identity, without the typical dissonance that comes from abjection. Shinji more or less just has one he clearly doesn't like, but as he has nothing to fall back on, he keeps going back to Unit 1. It becomes his very sense of purpose, itself being representative of success from the patriarchal framework. This is to the point where he pretty much merges with it, and ignoring the actual Freudian psychology for a second, this is important. It becomes that Shinji is his purpose, one that was forced upon him. Basically, he's a confused kid. And with no identity formed through actual desires, he latches onto the one given to him by his father. This, importantly, is a perspective and identity that sees others as being simple tools, means to an end. And since Shinji is a horny teen, he starts to see someone like Asuka as a release for his pent-up sexual frustrations. He tries to justify this by claiming she is never nice to him, that she never tries to understand him. Rei, of course, calls him out on this, asking if Shinji ever tried himself to understand Asuka. To Shinji, Asuka isn't really a person. Sure, he's afraid of her, but that fear doesn't center around a person in his mind, but rather serves only as a justification for him to distance himself from her and others. They don't understand him, yet he not only never tried to understand them, he never even viewed them as being real people. This is what Ray is calling him out on, and I think this comes from a place, again, of being taught to see other people as tools, sure, but also as extensions of himself. As if he is the protagonist of the world, and every girl or woman in said world are just parts of his story. In this way, he's not much different than Jimmy with Anya, but he denies this. Asuka, of course, has a damning response of her own, however.
バーカ、知ってんのよ、私をおかずにしてること。いつも見たくやってみなさいよ。ここで見ててあげるから。
She wants Shinji, all of Shinji, but the boy only wants parts of her. He doesn't even respond to her request to do what he already did, this time in front of her, because that would serve to break the barrier he has between himself and others. Actual sexual activity as opposed to simple fantasy would force Shinji to realize that they are indeed real, and that's something that scares him. Especially when he is confronted by all the women in his life that they are nice to him. And then, through his response, we get to the root of this issue. He is scared of the truth. He is terrified that if he doesn't adopt this persona, if he doesn't carry out his purpose, then people will stop liking him. If he doesn't just get in the robot, then he will not be loved. This line is, of course, born from his father's abuse, but it's not exclusive to it. Evangelion is a series with broken people, those dealing with their own traumas and issues, yet Shinji believes that if he does what he's supposed to do, what they tell him to do, then he is automatically worthy of their love and admiration. In this way, he directly correlates love with his purpose, and this is a concept not unseen in today's society. Many men, young and old, believe if they make a lot of money, or are conventionally attractive, or if they are especially nice to women, then they are owed female attention. While obviously this concept is rather stupid, and love is much more complex than any one factor, what's important here today is that boys and men primarily think this because that's what they've been told. And at this point, I shouldn't have to tell you that they were told this by a system, again, built by men. Shinji subscribes to this idea, even if subconsciously, and when he finally reaches out to Asuka in admittedly the most pathetic way possible, she rejects him. Because she was not put on this planet to save him. She is her own person, doesn't owe him anything. Shinji, well, he doesn't take this very well, and thus enacts the third impact. This is both his heaven and his hell, as he can finally connect with others without ambiguity, but is also forced to connect with others without ambiguity. You see, he thought himself an honest boy, one that didn't partake in the hedgehog's dilemma. He thought he was able to connect to others in a pure way, without ever realizing he was guilty of the same ambiguity he accused others of. Now, within the primordial soup, he is actually forced to confront others, yes, but more importantly himself. What he finds there, as seen with mostly episode 25 and 26, is a lot, but for today's purposes, it seems he has found his actual answer. He cannot exist without others. And in this realization, he discovers his own identity not through a society, but through a society of people. He rejects his father, the very system, and decides to form actual relationships based on mutual respect, even if it's hard, nigh impossible. Even if he ends up in his male fantasy again, he'll try and try again. And I think that's a beautiful message. So then, what is men as horror? Above all, it should be a lesson, in that we have to be aware of these overhead factors at play. Men and women alike need to be cognizant that there are powers at play that want to dictate who we are, down to our very core. These powers want us to yearn for that same power without accounting for the others around us. What Shinji learns through his trials is that, above all, beyond the abject horror and the male gaze, He must be kind. The type of kindness that simply sees other people, especially women in his life, as, well, people. To break out of the elaborate fantasy and recognize we're all humans living on this beautiful earth. It's not a perfect solution, but it's certainly a start. And, as always, thank you for watching.